Nature is a wonder, but it is so much more than wonderful. It is essential to all that we value in life.
Nature is our life support system. It is the source and sustainer of the air we breathe, the food we eat, the energy we use.
And the world of business and finance is entirely dependent upon it.
Resilience is bolstered by biodiversity.
Over 1 million species will go into extinction within this century. Business as usual is no longer an option.
Without nature, we have nothing.
The natural system is our most important and our most valuable asset class, yet we don't assign a value to it. We take its services and rely on it for free. We don't pay for those services, and we don't invest into it. And this is where the problem lies.
Since the Industrial Revolution, the dependable, resilient natural world has been the foundation of a booming global economy. And our prosperity continues to be built at the expense of nature. Our landscapes are degrading. Our oceans depleting.
During the space of a single human lifetime, my lifetime, we have changed the planet so much that the benign, stable conditions which underpinned both the growth of our civilizations and the trade and financial systems have ended.
A healthy natural world is essential for the planet's resilience. It is the foundation for all cash flows, all supply chains, and all investment values. And nature is essential as we face down the challenge of net zero.
Climate and nature are two sides of the same coin. The planet is an integrated system. You have to think about them as one joined up planetary system.
The science tells us that there is a real chance that we will hit tipping points soon, creating a future of escalating risks for investors, businesses, economies, even whole societies.
The loss of biodiversity has reached unprecedented rate in the history of humankind. It's not just an environmental issue. It is an economic issue, it is a financial issue, it's a developmental issue.
We simply can't afford nature to decline any further.
Unless we put resilience into our business models and resilience into nature, we will not have business models that will survive. That is very clear, and you can see many examples of where this is happening in real life right now.
From manufacturers dependent on water, to food producers and pharmaceutical companies dependent on pollinators, businesses and investors across all sectors are exposed. But the good news is that business and finance can have a central role in building back nature's resilience. Businesses across the world are now appreciating that sustainability is the only viable business plan, not only to mitigate risks, but also to seize upon a new age of opportunity.
The cost that we are incurring as a result of destruction of biodiversity is significantly higher than what it would cost us to prevent the issues in the first place. And that makes it such an attractive business opportunity for all of us. And leading companies understand that it is just not about risk mitigation, but positioning your company for the future that we all want.
That future is one in which business innovates to demand less of our natural world and harnesses the regenerative capacity of nature itself.
Whilst the challenges ahead are immense, so are the opportunities. The opportunity to reconfigure business models, to change investment portfolios, to invest in the markets and the companies that are innovating and pioneering. The future, if we choose to go there, is very bright. It's business, finance, society and nature prospering in harmony. But we have to start now.
And if we do, nature will recover, bringing back the resilience and productivity on which we all depend.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Royal Society and to the UK launch of the TNFD recommendations. My name's Rhiann Mary Thomas. I head up the Green Finance Institute. When we first established the Institute about 4.5 years ago, I was often asked, but what is green finance, Rhiann? To which I'd always answer, it's the application of climate science to financial decision-making. As the climate scientists' models become an ever more observable and harrowing reality, the need to integrate climate into our business and financial decisions remains as relevant and as urgent as ever. But the intrinsic links between nature and climate mean that that original definition is insufficient. It was Andrew Mitchell, founder of Global Canopy and recipient of the 2023 Founders Medal from the Royal Geographical Society, who first conceived and catalysed the idea of following in the footsteps of the TCFD by developing a set of recommendations to integrate nature into business and finance practice. The journey from concept to delivery has been an extraordinary collaborative effort. Co-chaired by David Craig and Elizabeth Marema and led by Tony Goldner and Emily McKenzie, the TNFD has involved hundreds of organisations, thousands of individuals, has sought the expertise and insights of scientists, civil society actors, multilateral organisations, corporates, financial institutions, representatives of local communities and Indigenous people, and has benefited from the support of philanthropic foundations and multiple governments, including the generous sponsorship of the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs within His Majesty's government. Indeed, we're really honoured to be joined by the Secretary of State this evening, as we were in New York last week. At the GFI, we've been really proud to play our part, co-chairing the informal working group to stand up the task force, hosting the Secretariat on our platform and convening the UK consultation group. But this evening, as we gather to celebrate this milestone, the launch of the TNFD Toolkit, here at the Royal Society, an organisation dedicated to promoting excellence in science for the benefit of humanity, this evening is about passing the baton to all of you, the corporates and the financial institutions, to elevate the discussion to the boardroom and to integrate the analysis of the interaction between capital flows and nature into your decision-making, and make sure that nature, as well as climate, becomes the business of business. Thank you so much for coming. All that's left for me to say is to welcome our speakers this evening. We'll be hearing from the Right Honourable Therese Coffey, Secretary of State for DEFRA, David Craig, co-chair of the TNFD. But first, please join me in welcoming to the stage our generous co-host for this evening, Sir Adrian Smith, President of the Royal Society.
Good evening to everyone, and thank you for that introduction to the Royal Society. It's a great pleasure as President to welcome you all here. We're delighted as the Royal Society to be supporting the Green Finance Institute and the task force by hosting this event. Protecting and restoring nature is a key implicit priority for the Society's work. As was said, our mission is to promote excellence in science, but not just to promote it, to make sure it pulls through for the benefit of humanity. So business action is essential for the goal that you're about this evening, but the science-based framework that I hope the Royal Society has contributed to and will continue to contribute to will underpin a lot of what I'm sure you will want to do. It is, of course, a sad fact that human activities are having devastating effects on wild animals, plant populations. Extinction rates are somewhat 100 times faster now than in pre-human times, and the pace of extinction is accelerating. These are sobering kind of thoughts. Perhaps coming a bit late to the party, we're learning more and more about how our economies and our lives depend on this complex web of interactions between living organisms. So the Royal Society has a lot of work in progress to ensure that the biodiversity crisis is treated with at least the same urgency as the climate crisis. They are, of course, interrelated. So at the last Biodiversity Conference of Parties, there was much discussion about whether business disclosure of nature-related risks should be mandatory. The Royal Society was instrumental in the S7 part of the G7 to try and get this on the agenda. In the end, of course, a voluntary approach was agreed, but businesses should not, of course, wait for policymakers to tell them what they need to do to manage these risks. We, of course, believe that these should be integral to good business practices. And with this in mind, we have a policy team here at the Royal Society. We've begun work with one of our fellows, Partha Dasgupta, to organise an event on how ecological risks translate to commercial risks, I think very relevant to tonight's discussion. So the event is intended to raise awareness among the financial services industry of the risks everyone that businesses should ensure and audit, be exposed to audit, and so help everyone ultimately to make the right kind of decisions of managing the risk and restoring nature. So I think that for many people here that will be an event of interest, so please do get in touch with our policy team if you would like to join in. That's the Royal Society focus. The background, of course, to all this is what's been said already. A lot of interested parties. Very good that the Secretary of State and DEFRA are supporting this, but many governments internationally, Australia, France, Germany, UN Development Programme, etc. I think we have something like nearly 60 countries and well over 1,000 institutions contributing to the reporting framework and so on. So the BETA framework is a market-led, science-based framework that will enable companies and financial institutions to integrate nature into decision-making. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that work. So we will continue to argue from the basis of the excellence of science and the pull-through of science in the hope that financial reporting frameworks will eventually become mandatory in future iterations of the Global Biodiversity framework. So from the Royal Society, the very best of luck to you in your deliberations this evening.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a massive event that we're having here tonight. And yes, I was in New York last week with Rhian Murray and David and a number of other people for the global launch. But I think I'm so pleased to be here because, let's be candid, it is thanks to the leadership of those two people who are speaking today who really have driven this right around the world. And of course, we've done that in partnership with many other institutions, many other governments. But it's genuinely thanks to these people who've really done the drive. The culmination of 2 years of hard work from all involved at the task force, including at the GFI HQ. It's been a real effort, and it's been absolutely vital that we've been backing you all the way to make this happen. If I can think of a few years ago when I was in Unger and COP 5 years ago, nature really was the Cinderella. And it was in Glasgow at COP26 when Cinderella got properly invited to the ball. But now, having commissioned already the Dasgupta review that came through, some of the other Montreal summits and similar, I know working also with Baroness Penn, who's here tonight from the Treasury, you know, frankly, for the first time, it felt that nature was Barbie and climate was Ken. But it's really important that we continue that momentum. And finally, we've got a grasp of that. And I'm delighted that, I don't know if this is public, but I know, Rian, you are planning to come and help us on a further challenge, which we have initiated between ourselves and the French government about global biodiversity markets. And there's a lot of work already starting to get underway into that. So I'm really proud of, as I say, the commitment, the leadership, the mobilisation, because all of those were necessary in making this happen. And of course, I want to continue as Secretary of State for the Environment here in the UK to make sure that we keep our commitments to domestic and international targets and to leading the world on green finance, that we are acting to restore nature and mobilise green finance here in the UK and around the world. And of course, about the mobilisation, we want to encourage business leaders to engage with TNFD recommendations. And I'm delighted that GSK, I think, have been the first company to lead to that. So in terms of, we all know about how we couldn't survive without nature, but frankly, it's a lot easier to say to people why they get it about bees. They don't quite get it on certain kinds of bugs or beetles or other sorts of things, and we still need to keep that agenda going. But we have to do that regardless, because we know that without investing in nature, without protecting nature, who's given so much to us, if we don't do something to help them, then we truly are all in trouble. So in terms of, we continue to invest in programmes like the £500 million Blue Planet Fund. There are other aspects that we're doing to increase forest cover, restore peatlands. We're actually one of the very few countries in the world where we are transitioning our farming subsidies in this country to fully reward sustainable agriculture rather than just subsidies for general food production and how much land you own. But we do know that it's impossible to do this simply with taxpayers' money, and that's why we need investors, we need businesses, we need banks to invest more, to align more, and to align their portfolios and activities with nature's recovery. Now, we have set ourselves a target of reaching at least £500 million of private investment in nature each year within 5 years, and that's to rise to £1 billion a year by the end of the decade. So we are putting in place our biodiversity net gains when it comes to aspects of development. We are working in partnership with the British Standards Institute to develop robust standards for nature markets. And as I say, we continue to develop the Global Biodiversities Framework. And of course now, TNFD, your recommendations will provide an invaluable tool for unlocking further investment in our natural environment and creating new opportunities. And understanding and reporting on these nature-related risks will inject resilience into business models and financial portfolios. They'll help to improve brand value and will open up access to new markets, products and revenue streams. Now, that could be harnessing the combinations of the strong expertise that we have on both finance and science to support new developments in technologies to monitor and restore nature. So the UK government remains committed to really pushing this around the world. I really want to thank you for all that you're doing. When I was in DWP, we managed to regulate to put TCFD in place for pension funds. So my commitment tonight is to try and persuade Mel Stride to do the same for TNFD and all our pension funds. It may take a little bit of time, but just like nature knows, you have to start with something and suddenly it will bloom and blossom. And that's what we need to do. So really wonderful to be here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the evening, particularly from our next speaker, David.
Well, good evening. Whoops, I've broken the technology already. Well, I think you know who I am. Thank you, Sir Adrian, for those remarks and hosting us for this really exciting launch tonight. Thank you, Minister of State, too, for her opening remarks and the incredible support the UK government has given us over the last 2.5 years. UK government's been our largest funder for the TNFD and our biggest advocate as well. And the Minister of State has now come to 2 launch events, which is pretty incredible. I'm wondering whether you're coming to Japan next week and Singapore the week after and others. So,
I don't want to offset all that carbon.
yeah, exactly. But let's go back to that film. I hope you agree that was a powerful piece that we put together there. And I hope that it opened your eyes and your hearts to the issue that we face. So why are we here? We're here because we need to change the relationship between business, finance, and nature. And we're here because we need your help to do that at purpose and with speed. What you saw in the film tells the story of financing the destruction of our planet. This is a crisis of our own making due to the disregard for the importance of nature and building an economy and financial system over the last 200 years very successfully, which uses the services of our most valuable asset, the natural system, uses them for free. And as Partha Dasgupta said in his groundbreaking report back in 2019, the present and future cash flows that are the foundation of your business and your capital depend on the flow of nature's services into your business models, into our economies and societies. And I really think people are beginning to wake up to that. So we have to change that. There are no people, there's no prosperity, there are certainly no pension funds in a dead planet. So with Elizabeth Mremner, I co-chair the TNFD. Last week we had an incredible launch in New York. We literally put the animal spirits in the heart of the financial market on the New York Stock Exchange. We put the bees on the trading floor. And we were really thrilled with the launch because there was a buzz going around New York Climate Week. Thank you. Fantastic support and excitement, really excitement across it. But importantly with launch, and you're going to hear from Emily in a moment about what we actually recommended and what the framework is, we had over 100,000 engagements from over 100 countries, well over 10,000 downloads already of the framework. This is really, really encouraging, and what's impressive is the global nature of this movement. But of course, launching here in London is really, really special. As I look across the room, many of you have been yearning and supporting for this for a long time. We have UK government, of course, and DEFRA. We have our funders, our stewards, our task force members. Many of you are in the room, some of whom you'll hear from later. So this feels like a bit of a celebration, feels like a bit of a wedding. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the wedding speeches later. But of course, this is only the start of a marriage between nature, finance, and business. TNFD is a tool. It's a vital tool, but it's not enough to make the change. It's one of the important things that we need to do. Importantly, we need to change our mindsets. Addressing climate change is, of course, critical and now firmly entrenched in the risk registry of companies and capital providers. But as the scientists will tell you, climate change is only one of the 5 drivers of impact to nature loss identified. The other 4 drivers, how we use land or freshwater or oceans, how we extract resources, the pollutants we put out, how we encourage invasive species, these also need urgent attention because, of course, our beautiful Mother Earth does not compartmentalize different initiatives. It thinks about the planet as a holistic system. So we won't get anywhere with a climate now, nature later response. In fact, the only way we can address climate change is to harness nature as well. Like the Paris Agreement for Climate, we now have a clear set of goals and targets for nature, the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's time to accelerate action, and I'm really proud of the contribution that the TNFD seeks to make for that collective challenge. But we should remind ourselves, we only have 7 harvests left before the GBF deadlines of 2030. And targets such as 30 by 30 really need to be achieved. And we will hear shortly from some of our knowledge partners, the thousands of people that Rianne-Marie mentioned who have rallied around, the 40 task force members who've contributed to this effort. It's been a remarkable textbook example of open innovation and collective action. But I want to remind ourselves that whilst we celebrate, we're just at the end of the beginning and the start of the next phase. The real work starts now. We have to mobilize business and financial institutions to accelerate efforts to bring nature into those business decisions. But how do we get started? What do we do? One thing we should do, nature is beautifully integrated and complex, but let's not yet let complexity be an excuse or lack of data or perfect targets as a problem. Just because nature is complex does not mean our response needs to be complicated. And that's where TNFD comes in it. As I see it, a pragmatic tool for managing these risks, shifting our mindset and actions for market participants. It has been tested in the market. Over 240 organizations from across the globe have already engaged in pilots. I spent 30 years in the information and insight business, providing the metrics and data to feed information for market participants. And disclosure is important, but disclosures alone won't change the world in isolation. This is really about embedding nature into the enterprise and portfolio risk management practices of companies, financial institutions, investors, and stakeholders in society. This is about repositioning your business. This is not another ESG project. It's about the strategy in the future. And that's the focus for today, and that's what we're going to hear from Emily in a moment on our panel. But before I hand over to Emily, who will take us through what's actually inside TNFD, I just want to do two things. Firstly, acknowledge thousands of individuals and organisations that come together over the last 2.5 years. Many of you, I'm so excited, are here today. I want to thank the incredible Secretariat team led by Tony and Emily and the others. I want to thank the 40 individual task force members and their delegates. These are people who've become very familiar to all of us. They've become friends from the late nights, the evenings, the weekends. They've literally given up to represent their companies, to bring their knowledge forward. I want to thank 1,200 forum members, our scientific and NGO partners, WWF, who are here today, Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership, Capitals Coalition, CDP, IUCN, ISSB, many of whom have really worked collectively with us. And of course our funders, not just the governments, Global Canopy, Children's Investment Fund, the MacDoc, UNDP and EP. Of course, I want to thank the Green Finance Institute and Rhianne Marie for providing us with the platform on which to run this project at incredible pace. But lastly, and most importantly, before I hand over to Emily, I have an ask. Andrew, who will talk at the end, Andrew Mitchell, will talk about this ask, and he'll bring alive the animal spirits of TNFD and what he's going to ask you to do. But I want you to leave you with this. We already have a lot of momentum. We surveyed our 1,200 forum members, and of the respondents, 70% said that they will already adopt TNFD using financial year 2024 outcomes, 80% on financial year 2025 outcomes. That's quite remarkable that that number of companies and financial institutions are already looking at the adoption of TNFD. And as we saw last week, GSK from our task force have already said that they're going to adopt, MS&AD from Japan, Swire Group from Hong Kong, Ecopetrol, Colombia's largest company, Morova from France, all committing to TNFD, as well as other banks have already said, Rabobank, Sanlam in South America, United Utilities in the UK. But separately, I'd always also encourage the asset owners and managers to take a lead. BlackRock, Aviva, Norwegian MBIM have already said that they expect their portfolio companies to adopt the TNFD. They've publicly asked for this. That's well over 6,000 public companies and trillions of dollars of assets. That really makes a difference when the asset owners ask. So let's enjoy the wedding today and celebrate the start of a new relationship between nature, finance, and business. But let's make this a commitment as friends for the marriage to work. The fact is, if we don't do this, we will destroy the future for our future generations. This is about leadership and repositioning our business. As Mary Shapiro said last week, we are running out of time. 7 harvests left until the GBF goals, 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries crossed. Every penny, every euro, every cent we reinvest, redirect, and every centimetre, kilometre of nature we save starts to count. So to kick us off, I'm going to invite to the stage our technical director, Emily McKenzie, before the panel. Emily is a natural economist. She's fearlessly engaged science, business and finance over the last 2 years to lead the creation of the TNFD recommendations and guidance for the team. Over 20 years, Emily's had a distinguished background in natural economics and policy. She played a pivotal role in the Dasgupta Review. And as I think about this, success in life is always due to working with great, talented people. But if they have a smile on their face, then that's pure heaven. Emily, thank you.
Thank you, David. That was a very kind introduction. And if I'm going to take the lid off the box and show you a bit of what's inside what TNFD published, but just to indulge me for a moment, I just want to remember that it was 2.5 years ago that the Dasgupta Review was published. Royal Society also hosted this launch, and I had that great honour and privilege to be Partha Dasgupta's right-hand woman in creating that. And I think it's worth just reminding ourselves of its messages, because it makes clear the importance of what TNFD has produced, and also the absolute criticality of people now putting it into action. So the key messages of the Dasgupta review was that our economies, as the video made clear, our economies, livelihoods, and well-being all depend on our most precious asset, which is nature, that we have collectively, all of us, public and private, failed to engage sustainably with nature, such that our demands on it far greater than its ability to keep providing us with these services we depend on, and that this is endangering the prosperity of current and future generations. And most interestingly for TNFD, that this is creating significant macroeconomic and financial risks with implications for business and financial institutions. And in its many recommendations and options for change, which I am familiar with, it recommended that businesses and financial institutions should assess and disclose their use of nature. So a little over 2 years later, I'm very proud to say that the Dasgupta Review tree has, and this is Partha's words, borne TNFD fruit. And today, in person, I can say that those recommendations and guidance are now ready to use. So let me just check I can. So as David mentioned, I have the luxury of slides. I just want to mention the buzzing of the bees at the New York Stock Exchange at our launch event was a very symbolic moment for making that clear, that for all of you now, businesses and financial institutions in the room, you can now assess your impacts and dependencies on nature and your risks and opportunities for your organisation that result from that, and following TNFD's recommendations, make that clear and transparent to those who use your reports. And I won't dwell on the process because Rianne Marie and David have already spoken eloquently about this, but I just did want to take one moment to acknowledge that this has been a mighty co-creation process. And thank you to the thousands of you who have contributed from the task force and all of us in the Secretariat. There have been many experts and organisations. I particularly would like to thank our 19 knowledge partners, who David alluded to, because it has been their expertise, but also all that they had built already, their definitions, the metrics, the frameworks, the methods that we have drawn together and consolidated. Rather than reinventing the wheel, we have integrated the best of what existed. And we've also learned hugely from pilot testing, from learning by doing, which has meant that not only is it based in the science, but across sectors and geographies, we've tested what we've done to know that it can be practical to implement. So I just, before I go into the box itself, wanted to set the scene a bit about how we're seeing what's in the box having impact. So learning from the experience of TCFD, the TNFD anticipates its recommendations being used along 3 interrelated paths. First of all, any organisation can already implement the TNFD's recommendations on a voluntary basis, just like with TCFD. Second, the TNFD recommendations will inform the further development of global sustainability standards, notably those being developed by the International Sustainability Standards Board and the GRI, and we've worked very closely with both as knowledge partners, and we'd like to thank them for that, and we stand ready to continue to support their efforts as they move into developing nature disclosure standards when they're ready. Finally, the TNFD recommendations can move down to the bottom of this figure, so informing regulatory developments led by regulators in different jurisdictions. And we've already had a precedent of that working with EFRAG in Europe, where while they've been developing the European sustainability reporting standards to ensure that consistency and reference with the TNFD's recommendations. Next, before I fully get into the box, I could not mention the word materiality, because as we've developed the TNFD's recommendations, the M word always comes up, and the task force and all of us are always asked, what approach are we taking? But the answer from the task force has been, it's not for us to determine the materiality approach. It is now true we live in a world with different approaches to materiality in different jurisdictions. So as David emphasised, we've created a tool, a set of recommendations that accommodate different approaches, whether that be to meet the material information needs of capital providers consistent with the ISSB standards, where the focus may be on risk management and how dependencies and impacts create risks and opportunities to the organisation, but also to meet broader materiality needs consistent with GRI and the ESRS focused on impacts. So what's in the box? At the centre of what we've produced, the TNFD has published 14 recommended disclosures, and these should feel reassuringly familiar, even if you cannot read the screen. I hope those of you who have applied the TCFD recommendations will recognise the same 4 pillars. We use the same structure of governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. And we've done that for 2 important reasons: to enable it to be easy to build on what you've already done for climate, and to encourage an integrated approach, which is something the task force feels is very important. And we've also aligned to be consistent with the IFRS S1 standard. So what have we added? Well, of course, those 11 disclosures have been amended to be relevant for nature, but we've also thought very hard in a very disciplined way about what new disclosures would be needed with the rationale of thinking about nature. And in doing so, the task force has added 3 new disclosures. The first relates to engagement, specifically with affected stakeholders and Indigenous peoples and local communities, recognising the importance of meaningful engagement with those groups for assessment and disclosure. The second is around the interface with priority locations, and that's been added because nature-related issues are specific to location, and certain types of ecologically sensitive location can create elevated risks. And the third new disclosure is specifically focused on value chains, because the task force recognised, as with Scope 3, the importance and complexity, because of the data issues, for looking upstream and downstream. So those are the new disclosures. We're also, one of the complex aspects of the task force's approach has been on measurement. Without having the greenhouse gas protocol as the equivalent for nature, but having other things we can build on, like the UN system for environmental economic accounting, which now has a UN statistical standard for ecosystem accounting. We've worked very closely with our science partners and with the market to create this comparable, decision-useful measurement framework. So we did a big review about 2 years ago, found 3,000 metrics, and then have just managed to consolidate that into this overall structure that enables flexibility to have meaningful information for specific sectors, because a lot of this is very specific to sectors and business models, but also that comparability within and across sectors. So that leads us to our 14 core global indicators. We have 9 on dependencies and impacts, 5 on risks and opportunities. And then we have a set which we put out as draft and will continue to improve, to publish and finalise in 2024, of course, sector metrics, and a set of additional indicators and metrics to create that flexibility so that the material information for your organisation you can disclose. So what we've released today is a package. At the top of the pyramid sit the recommendations. That's the equivalent of the 2017 TNFD recommendations report, which will be familiar to many of you. But there is also this great base underneath it, which, based on feedback from many of you and others around the world, we've created additional guidance, notably something called the LEAP approach, which many of you may have tested, which is how you assess your nature-related issues, but then on specific topics by sector, by biome, looking at scenario analysis, target setting, and engagement. And most importantly, our latest breaking guidance we decided just a few months ago is about getting started. So for anyone this seems a bit daunting, you can open our Getting Started guidance. So just briefly, this is just a nutshell, and David spoke about this already. What's next for TNFD? We're now, as David has frighteningly emphasised, just getting started ourselves with this really critical next phase. We hope with many of you will have expanded engagement to increase awareness and adoption, a real focus on capacity building, and then more work on guidance in particular areas like transition planning, data, and sector guidance. So we look forward to working with many of you again and continue to work with you in this next phase. And with that, I will hand to the panel to bring it all to life. Rhian.
Thank you to all our speakers, and thank you very much to you, Emily, for those recommendations and also for your leadership. So now I'm going to hand over to our panel, and in particular to the chair, the eminent journalist Sophie Robinson-Tillett, who's been writing on the topics of environment and sustainability for many, many years. So thank you. Over to you, Sophie.
Hi, can everyone hear me all right? Great, fab. Welcome, everyone. As Marie said, I'm Sophie Robinson-Tillett. I'm very conscious of time. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Thank you to our previous speakers who all wonderfully sort of threw down the anchor as to the big picture here about where we're at. We're going to focus a bit more on how to take that baton on, how to take the TNFD recommendations forward through business and society, and move to the next phase. So in order to do that, I'd like to welcome our wonderful panelists. If we may, do you want to all come up, and then I'll introduce you once you're seated. Lovely, thanks for joining. So I'm joined by C.S. Venkatakrishnan, the CEO of Barclays, and this is all in the wrong order on my list, Baroness Penn from UK Treasury. We've got David Croft, Group Head of Sustainability at Reckitt on the end, Tanya Steele, the CEO of WWF UK, and Professor Andy Purvis from the Royal Society.
Natural History Museum.
And from the Natural History Museum. Oh, goodness. Thank you for joining us. As I said, we're going to talk a little bit about passing the baton on to society and business now that we have these recommendations out there. And I guess the obvious starting point really is, and we've touched on this a bit already, but why the urgency here? Because, I mean, I'm a financial journalist, and I talk to a lot of investors and businesses that are a bit paralyzed by the amount of climate stuff they have to do right now. I'm sure there are many of them hoping they might be able to leave this bit for a little bit further down the line. So how much of a priority does nature and biodiversity have to be at the moment? Jojo, maybe I can start with you.
Well, I think we've already heard from all the speakers today that there's no pathway to delivering on net zero without protecting and restoring nature. And so it's absolutely central to our goals around net zero. And hopefully the good news, therefore, for businesses and companies that are engaging with climate change and their net zero goals and plans is, although this may feel additional, it's actually integral. And if you're a business that does TCFD reporting already, as we've heard, TNFD is very consciously trying to follow the same kind of approach, so it feels familiar. I think in the piloting that TNFD has done, they've heard feedback from businesses worried about this, that actually there's a huge amount of overlap here. We've got the Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed last year at Montreal that sets us the target to restore and protect nature by 2030. So that's a more immediate target and date than we have for climate, although there's obviously key stepping stones along the way there. And if you're engaging with developing a transition plan, which we're really focused on here in the UK, you can't engage on some of those questions without thinking about your impacts and dependencies and risks and opportunities when it comes to nature. And so we're also, Tanya's leading work for the Transition Plan Task Force about how nature factors into transition planning, and it was great to hear that that's part of TNFD's future work too. So it's absolutely central, but hopefully the approach taken by organisations such as TNFD integrates it into the work that people are already doing, so it doesn't feel additional.
Okay, so no sequencing. And the sustainable finance spends a lot of time talking about these issues without the scientists in the room, so I'm very pleased that you're here. Can you sort of shed a bit of light on the kind of urgency from a scientific perspective on this?
Yes, sure. So we've got a million species of animals and plants threatened with extinction at the moment, which is, as was mentioned earlier, the extinction rate is at least hundreds, probably thousands, maybe tens of thousands times higher than before we got started. And species extinction would be a huge tragedy, but it's not even, for me, the really scary thing. The really scary thing is the rapid degradation of ecosystems to the point where our supply chains never get going. So we've seen with various shocks around the world over the last few years how fragile our society, our whole socio-economic system is to supply chain disruption. And nearly all of our supply chains start in nature. These systemic risks are the ones that really scare me. And yeah, 7 harvests. It is not long. So nature has this fantastic ability to rejuvenate, regenerate, restore if we get off its back. It's not a time for desperation, but we really do have to get a wiggle on, and we have to get everyone's efforts aligned. So we need, for the global biodiversity framework, to be laying down challenges, and we need civil society, businesses, governments to be rising to those challenges, speaking the same language, working with quantities that track so we can see, as is relatively easy in the climate space, for instance, whether the pledges, whether the changes are enough to make the future projections favourable and livable. This is really, really super urgent stuff, and so it's fantastic to see so many organisations represented here, and fantastic to see all the work that TNFD has done to help accelerate it.
And Tanya, if I can bring you in, I mean, what happens if this doesn't happen fast enough in the private sector, if these things are not taken up and run with as fast as the urgency suggests they should be?
Well, perhaps I'll flip that the other way. We don't have a choice. We simply do not have a choice. Even if we just look at the pure economics of this, over 50%, I think it's 55% of GDP, as outlined by Swiss Re 3 years ago, is highly dependent on functioning ecosystems. And we know what spawns from GDP is effectively our ability to live healthily in terms of global and world economies. So I think, for me, any potential stepping back and a sense that we can't get there, we really do not have a choice. And I know many colleagues have highlighted the very important role of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed in Montreal. In fact, Secretary of State Therese Coffey was very much there and very much behind the scenes in terms of the negotiations. That's sort of a bedfellow, if you like, to the commitments from a climate perspective. But the reality is the work on biodiversity is at least a decade, probably 15 years behind. And one of the things we did not secure at that framework, we secured very good agreements, and again, only agreements for protection of land. We did not secure agreements or commitments in terms of how we would reduce our footprint, and we walk very heavily on this planet. So we can get very excited about perhaps protecting 30% of our oceans and our land, but it's the pressure we are putting on the 70% that is actually going to drive the challenges for the future. And that's where this framework comes in. This is an opportunity, particularly owned, led by the financial community, led by businesses, to actually start to assess the risks and indeed the weight of that footprint that we level out every single day.
And this is about exposure to dependencies, I suppose. We've heard quite a lot there about urgency, about supply chains, about whole economy mobilisation. It's a big old task we're talking about. David Craig pointed out earlier the sort of number of companies that are starting to move on this. David, can I ask you from a corporate perspective, where do you start with something like this when it comes to assessing your exposures, and what challenges are you likely to face as a company when you begin this journey?
Well, I mean, I think the starting point is to begin by saying this is about core business. This isn't about an ESG project. This is about how you build resilience and then potentially opportunity from that into your core business activity, about assets that perhaps historically nobody has valued in the way that the current conversation shows that we need to recognise them. The data is complex. metrics are complex. But by looking at the framework that TFD creates and starting to work more broadly, business is very good at making sense of complex issues and, more importantly, making them actionable. And it's that actionability that is the critical point here. That's why at Reckitt we began to work with partners at Nature-Based Insetting at Oxford University and also the Earthworm Foundation, and working with them on the ground with farmers in Southeast Asia, looking at our latex supply chain, which is incredibly important to our business. We now can start to measure the impacts that agriculture has had on that landscape, but more importantly, measure and introduce the interventions that will make a change. And that way, we're starting to find ways to reduce that risk, to Tanya's point, to reduce the footprint that businesses have, but to do so in a way that also connects nature, climate, and the communities. I think it's really important that we recognise that the TNFD framework allows you to do all of those three things together rather than sequentially as we've done in the past. And joining those three things together is critical, I think, for a sustainable intervention and ways of reducing that footprint for the future that gives us a resilient local environment that then rolls up to our global business.
Okay, and these sort of holistic flows of information, Venkat, that are going to come your way as a financial institution, why are they important? Why does things like the TNFD matter to you from where you sit in the economy?
Well, first of all, banks have a very, very critical role in the health of the economy. We reach people, we reach businesses, businesses operate through us. And as goes the economy, as goes the health of society and individuals and their financial being, so go we, right? So it is a symbiotic relationship if ever there was one. And you've heard why it's important. You've heard why it's actually not just important, but absolutely essential. That if we don't do this, that disaster stares us, and that why we need to measure and have a framework to do it. In fact, in many ways, it was appropriate that the launch in New York was in the New York Stock Exchange, and the launch here is in the Royal Society. Because if you look at some of those portraits and you look at the history of the Royal Society, it's all about measurement. Lord Kelvin, a former member of the Royal Society, said, if you can't measure, you have nothing. And it's the foundation of science. And it's the foundation of the way we think about it. That's why this is important. And it's part and parcel of the relationship with TCFD, because one looks at the agency of humans and how we can change the way in which we produce energy and consume energy. And this looks at this massive other source of capital, of regenerative capital in the earth, which is nature, and not just encouraging it and not destroying it. If you bring it down to the micro, Barclays, for instance, we work with and we finance 1 in 4 farms in the United Kingdom. Farming depends very clearly on nature, and we would want farms to succeed. So it's whether it's small or whether it's big, the role of the financial system and banking is essential in this.
Jojo, Venkat just brought it down to the micro. Can you bring it back up to the macro? How, from where you sit, are you looking at this from government from a sort of systemic risk perspective and that bigger economy-wide risk?
Well, I think everyone's pointed to actually the systemic nature of this, and the Network for Greening the Financial System of kind of central banks and others came together in March 2022 and made a statement acknowledging the nature-related financial risks. And I think this is really important, because if we're thinking about it as core business, if we're thinking about it from that point of view, articulating it from a kind of risk relevant to financial stability, you can then begin to see why it's so important that we have this transparency and information flow through the whole of our economy. So it's a really important thing for our regulators to think about. And we passed the new Financial Services and Markets Act this year that puts in our framework for regulating financial services post-EU, and that has a specific have regard for our regulators when it comes not just to climate risk, but thinking about nature too. And so our regulators will think about that. From a government perspective, it's always been thinking about the flow of information so that the right information and data flows from the real economy to financial firms and from financial services to end investors and to inform stakeholders. And if you have that understanding of the risk there and you have the right flows of information, then you should move to a place in which you have more accurate pricing in the market. And then it comes back to this point about it being in your core business interests, that you've taken this into account, you've assessed your dependencies and impacts, and you've looked at both your risks but also your opportunities. And so I think that's very much how we think about it in the United Kingdom government. I think the only thing I'd add is, in our experience in this, thinking about it as the United Kingdom government is all very well and good, but actually you need global baselines, you need interoperability. And so that's why we've been such supporters of the work of TNFD, TCFD, but also the translation into international standards such as through ISSB. And it's great to hear the amount of engagement that TNFD have had and their kind of forward programme of work thinking about that also.
So lots of information flowing around the system. That's the kind of goal in terms of managing systemic risk. Ben, can I come back to you? In terms of banks, they're obviously, as you said before, crucial to turning this into a conversation with the real economy. What are the next steps for banks around this?
Well, so just as with climate disclosures, TCFD, banks have to start studying the output of this work, which is prodigious. It's instructive. And we have to start integrating it into our frameworks in looking at this. So, another very critical part of banking is the standardization of the way in which we talk about our risks, as you've said, talk about opportunities, and so that all banks, all agencies, all individuals ultimately have standardized forms of talking about their exposure to nature, how they contribute to nature, and their dependency upon it. So that's what the next step for banks is to study this work and start over time integrating it into our frameworks.
Interesting. Andy, how do you put all of this information into the right context to tell you what you need it to tell you if you're a user of the information coming out of TNFD or one of these disclosure frameworks?
Yeah, so there's now unleashed a big demand for measures of everything, everywhere, all at once. And as anyone who's watched it, that can be quite confusing. So I think the key thing to bear in mind is be clear what metrics you're using and why it's those metrics that you're using. You should understand what they are telling you. You should understand what their limitations and caveats are. And if they say they haven't got any, don't use those metrics because all of the metrics at the moment have caveats. You should be looking for scientific rigor. I mentioned in what I said before that there are these two dimensions of biodiversity loss that are really concerning, one being species extinction, and then more economically consequential in the short run is ecosystems no longer functioning. Now, we need to keep tabs on both of those dimensions, and there isn't a metric that can do both. So we'll need to have two. My group at the Natural History Museum, we work on a measure of ecosystem integrity. So that's whether ecosystems are able to keep functioning, called Biodiversity Intactness Index. There are others in that are also ecosystem integrity measures that are within the TNFD toolkit. There are measures for the species extinction side of it as well. Now, Venkat mentioned you have to measure it.
We have to be able to reduce the complexity and the beauty of nature to numbers. But I also urge people not to lose sight of the fact that nature is so much more than these numbers. And this was a point that the Dasgupta review emphasized as well. We have to connect to that living world. So, yeah, when the numbers are going down, it's not just, oh, the numbers are going down. That's the tapestry of life that's falling apart in front of our eyes. That's that tapestry that we played on as kids when it was still rich, intact, and multicolored. And now it's threadbare and falling apart and grey. It's more than just numbers. So yeah, we do need the numbers, and they're around, but we mustn't lose track that these numbers really matter to all future generations.
There's a lot of sort of seriousness and heaviness to this. There is potentially upside as well, though, David. Presumably, if you get this right, as Andy said, and if you manage to find the suitable metrics and you manage to measure and capture this stuff, can this information become a driver of competitive advantage, of innovation from where you sit?
Absolutely, it can, Sophie. I mean, what we're seeing is that once you start to measure, then it changes the approach that you take. I mean, the business maxim of what gets measured gets done, absolutely taking into account Andy's point that there's a rich colour behind that. But what gets measured gets done allows people to start to work and understand and then take the right and best value interventions that make a difference. And we are starting to see that in terms of the agronomy that local small farmers are doing in southern Thailand. They're investing both to balance and protect and even enhance biodiversity because it works for them. But what that is also doing is increasing the biodiversity in the overall landscape. Sometimes also I think we get caught up on the birds, the bees and the bulls. There's a very basic element called water that's also at the heart of those ecosystems. And when we've worked with the WWF team, or when we've worked in India in areas of water stress, what we've seen is a rapid return of improved water tables, up to 7 meters in 1 year. That makes a huge impact. The plus point is it meant that for some certain farmers we work with, it wasn't just 1 harvest per year, it's become 2 or 3, because that impact happens very quickly. And that creates a socioeconomic value for them. It creates a health and social value for them. And for everybody who is dependent upon that water catchment area, including the nature that is part of it, tree planting, the flora and fauna that is part of it, but also absolutely including the businesses like us who depend on water from that catchment, it creates a real opportunity to go forward. And I think that's where this resilience becomes opportunity. And I said before, this is about making this conversation core business. When we were thinking in Reckitt about a new site in India, the first thing we thought about was how much water would be around in 25 years' time. And that's a standard conversation you would do in other parts of your business conversation. So bringing nature into that discussion is really what TNFD is all about. And the framework and the metrics and the guidance give you that framework to work consistently to bring nature to the core of your business activities and build resilience and opportunity from it.
Yeah, it goes to show how quickly we moved from a conversation about risk a few minutes ago to one about opportunities. That's a reassuring trajectory. We're almost out of time. I'm conscious that people will want to get out and enjoy their cocktails, but I want to talk about regulation. Anyone who knows me knows I always want to talk about regulation. Tanya, there's some people in this room probably who may be suffering from something close to PTSD from the amount of regulation that's come in primarily from the EU. I'm sure that lots of people have had SFDR bedtime reading lately too. So there is a big upside to having regulators intervene here. We've obviously seen it push climate right to the top of the agenda, regardless of whether where you sit in the ecosystem. But there are downsides too. What's the role of regulation in this conversation?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, what we've heard today is and congratulations again to the team for just a stunning piece of work, but about an incredibly important framework. And the question is that mandatory? Is it voluntary? The reality is, and you know, I wouldn't attempt to speak for many businesses and business leaders in this room, we do know that businesses, financial institutions do like stability, they like clarity, they certainly like to understand what both the policy and indeed whether it's the metrics or the disclosure style framework is moving forward. It's impossible because we know the cycles otherwise that businesses have to make decisions. David just talked about a 25-year decision in terms of where to locate a new business. Will water be there? But classically, these are long-term cycles that, of course, have to be reported back to shareholders, you know, as well as a whole bunch of other stakeholders that sit around the table as well. So I think it's very easy for us to get into this sort of, oh, is it just confusion? Is it a red tape mindset? Not at all. It actually provides a framework and some surety. And I guess I would flip it round again. We've heard many times this evening described very eloquently, whether on screen, whether on stage, we are running out of time. And the idea that there is an optionality about this feels frankly ludicrous. So how do we actually ensure that we put an appropriate framework in place that gives the opportunities for businesses, financial institutions to flourish, but actually do it in a way that, no, we will all walk together quickly to ensure that we're not facing the kind of risks that we've heard described this evening.
Okay. Jojo, the government laid out some interesting stuff in the Green Finance Strategy earlier this year. I think TCFD was a part of that. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that's looked like and what the implications or the future might be for TNFD in the same sort of context?
So I think, I mean, the UK has led the way in implementing TCFD. I think we were the first country that said we would move to mandatory disclosures against TCFD. We also then had the opportunity to use our presidency of the G7 to bring others along with us. And we now have the disclosure rules in place that have been introduced by the FCA, by BEIS and DWP, as Therese mentioned, on pensions. And they've been there since February 2022. That did build on a period of TCFD first being launched and in place in a voluntary way, businesses familiarising themselves with the framework. I think the pace at which TNFD has managed to develop its work is showing that we can go faster. We must go faster, but we can go faster. So I think we see a kind of a framework that we've had in place before for TCFD, but also the opportunity to move ahead at a faster rate. I think the other thing I would add is building on TCFD's work, we now have the work of the ISSB, and they've brought out their S1 and S2 standard, which we've committed to going through the process for endorsing in the UK within a year. And the FCA as a regulator has also set out how they see the incorporation of those standards into their approach. And so I think what we will see, or hopefully see, is this link up from TNFD into feeding into a global standard, because to your point, we're not always going to have the same standards, but can we have interoperable standards? Can we have at least narrow down the number of standards that we have and that they work together or speak to each other? Or if you're a business operating in multiple jurisdictions, the approaches all make sense with each other. So when you're thinking about it from your business point of view, then you can plug into the regulatory frameworks that are there. So I see a really positive path for the TNFD going forwards. I think the next step is for those businesses to engage, to incorporate it into their reporting frameworks. I think the piloting that was done was fantastic, but it's a different phase when it's launched and that you're really getting out there. And so we really look forward to both how businesses engage and disclose against the framework, and also the next steps in terms of incorporating it into an international framework also.
Yes, it's kind of unimaginable, the journey that climate has been on over the last 5 years or so, but it does seem to have leapfrogged a lot, and it sounds like there's some clear things for people in the room to take forward wherever they are, and sort of find opportunities, identify those exposures, create that shared language that you were talking about, and the interoperable, if not universal rules and standards. I think it's a really positive note to end on. Can everybody join me in thanking our wonderful panel? I think we're passing over to Andrew for some closing remarks, if we can.
You know, it's wonderful when just you get up here and all your notes disappear. To hell with the notes. This has been quite a party, I think. It's quite a party. It's been a bit of a, you know, Secretary of State has been talking about Ken and Barbie. We've had David talking about marriages. Lots of talk about birds and bees. I don't know what we're doing. Are we inventing a sort of dating agency or something like this in TNFD? Well, maybe it's not so much a dating agency as a data agency. You know, unlike climate, we don't have a target, do we? We don't have a 1.5 degrees for nature. We don't have a currency like a ton of carbon. That's a problem, isn't it? So when going back a long way, thinking up the idea of TNFD with a lot of help from the World Wildlife Fund and UNDP and my own think tank in Oxford, Global Canopy, it was a bit terrifying to get on this road because we didn't know how it was going to end. We didn't have the data, we didn't have the targets. And I said to the team right from the beginning, look, it doesn't matter if what we create isn't perfect, because right now we have nothing. So whatever we create, it's going to be better than that. But I would say that David, Elizabeth Mrema, head of the CBD at that time, and Tony Goldner and Emily and all the team have created something amazing. There is a fantastic amount of information. We don't have all the data, but we do have a guidebook. Now, you may have heard Klaus Knott, who's chair of the Financial Stability Board, and he also does something at the Dutch Central Bank. He said that setting out on this journey is a bit like climbing Everest. You know, central bankers like to have all the information ready before they make any decisions. But in this case, we're going to have to set out on the journey without all the information. And the important thing is to set the destination. I really liked Emily's nice blue pyramid. It looked a bit like Everest, I thought. And it says at the top, just get started. That's the document. That's what you all need to do. Is not be daunted, but just get started. There's only one number I'm going to give you. Numbers, I think, can be numbing, but I'm a zoologist originally. And sometimes we spend a lot of time thinking about numbers, but there's one that really you need to keep in mind, and it's 69. 69% of all wildlife populations since 1970 gone. Gone. It's that bad. Just as the Prof said, our tapestry of life is falling apart. And when you're setting out on a journey like this, it is a bit daunting. I can tell you the first time I tried to climb up into a rainforest canopy tree, that's really what I was interested in exploring way back, was the upper canopy of the rainforest. It was like a new continent of life, just 150 feet above our head. And I got up to my first big rainforest tree, and I'd managed to get some army engineers to set a rope ladder all the way up to the top. I could barely see it in the treetops. It seemed like an impossible journey to get to the top. I put my foot on the first rung. It broke. It was made of wood and a bit rotten. The second seemed a bit better, and I just thought, well, I'm going to go for it. So I climb up. I get a quarter of the way up, and I realize I've left my safety line off. I didn't clip on. I'm still hanging on to the ropes. I go higher, halfway up. Something extraordinary happens. The tree starts moving. I thought it was solid as a rock. I go higher, and the wind was swaying the branches from side to side. I looked down to the past. It was not a good idea. It was very frightening, and I know what that white knuckle feeling is like. But when I got to the top, determined to get to that destination, and looked out over those green valleys with bees the size of pigeons' eggs, great valleys of colour that no one had really seen before as scientists, it was fantastic. And our journey that we're starting today Because after all, even though we spent 3 years doing it, it's just the beginning. If we don't use what the team has created, we'll get nowhere. It'll be useless. Signing up to this is really important. You don't have all the data. You don't have a regulatory mandate, but you know it's the right thing to do for all our futures. So we're looking to have another party at the World Economic Forum in January. And we want all of those in business who are maybe thinking about this, not just our members who've been absolutely fantastic and created it, but those people who are wavering. Is this really what I want to do? You know, there's all that ESG kind of politicized pushback in the United States. If I say too much, am I going to end up in court? Liabilities, you know, all of that. You know that that is just choppy water on an inexorably rising tide. Don't get left behind. It will overwhelm you. And if you think that this stuff is small or slow or only affects agriculture, you are so wrong. Look at what COVID-19 has done to our world. What is that? It's a tiny speck of nature-related risk that nobody saw coming. And is bigger and faster than climate change. That's why we need to get familiar with TNFD. And so I would love you all to sign up on the website, those of you who haven't thought of that, to sign up on that website. So we're going to have already some amazing companies are. We're not going to release the names of these companies until we get there in January. I just wanted to end perhaps by saying a few thank yous because, you know, it was wonderful. If you go way back, President Macron did a pretty good job actually raising some of these issues on the global stage. But we couldn't have done it without the support of the UK government, particularly Neha, who's somewhere here in DEFRA, who did so much to try and sell our story. You know, when I first talked to Treasury, and I don't just mean the UK Treasury, a lot of others, trying to persuade them to do this, you know what they'd say? Oh, we're really busy doing climate now, can't nature wait? That's probably what some of you think. And then COVID-19 came along, and I said, did you get it now? And he said, yes, write a white paper quickly. You know, a big thank you to the UK, a big thank you to the World Wildlife Fund, a big thank you to UNDP, Global Canopy, and all the others who were in there at the beginning that I don't have time to mention. Many other governments were tremendously supportive with their political support and financial support. In particular, I'll call out Germany with a tremendous amount of support that they've given us. Because this is the beginning. The next 5 years is the take-up phase, phase 5 as we originally planned it. And we have to get to work and make this happen. And I want to ask you now to just simply join me in some very simple gift from nature. It's called a drink outside. Thank you very much, everybody. There's going to be some... There. There may be a little bit of flash photography, but let's keep the relationship going. I used to hug trees all the time in orangutan. I couldn't save them that way, so I now hug bankers and asset managers. So let's all give them a bit of love. Thank you very much.